everybody to Insight 2021. Sorry for the slightly delayed start, but we're ready to get underway. So the Midlands Decision Support Network, in association with the Strategy Unit, are hosting this Insight Festival, which is a festival of learning and sharing events for the NHS, local government and other partners across health and care. So we started the festival on Monday and it runs through till next Friday, the 15th of October. And the theme for this year is Insight to Action. So we've got a whole range of different inspirational speakers exploring how insights from high quality analysis can inform improvements and change in health and care systems. This afternoon, we're looking at what works in getting insights into action. So whether that's informing policy, strategy or practice, how can we get better at applying evidence to improve outcomes, and how can we best apply evidence or insights to take action? We've got two great speakers lined up this afternoon who are going to share their frameworks, reflections, their experiences to help us explore what works and explore some of the challenges involved. And I'm pleased today we're joined by Jonathan Brecken, currently Senior Policy Advisor to the Open Innovation Team in the government, and Jamie Hobday, who's Partnerships Teams Manager in West Midlands Police. I first came across Jonathan a few years ago when he was leading the Alliance for Useful Evidence at Nesta. And in particular around his project looking at the evidence around what works. And this was I remember being really excited about this project because it was based on robust research, reviewing evidence across the social sciences, and then translating those findings into practical recommendations that could be used by different services. And Jonathan's been involved in a range of different initiatives during his time at the Alliance for Useful Evidence, including setting up a champions network, connecting people across different sectors working in evidence and knowledge roles. And that's where I met Jamie a few years ago. And I remember learning about his work to introduce evidence-informed practice in the police service. And we had lots of conversations in that network about how, despite the fact we were all working in quite different contexts, and so facing quite different challenges in some ways, some of those challenges were really familiar or common across the different sectors. And it was really useful to have that space for that sort of cross-sector collaboration and learning and knowledge sharing. And obviously with the increase of integrated working and multi-agency working, it's increasingly important to be able to learn from and work with people in different sectors. So I'm really pleased Jonathan and Jamie have given us time to talk today and to share some of their thoughts and reflections. Unfortunately, Marianne Davey, who was on the agenda for today, hasn't been able to join us. But what we're hoping we can still have a conversation with Marianne and perhaps either reschedule or record that and share that at some other dates. So we will keep you updated via our website or via our Twitter feed as soon as we've got that set up and that's available. So I'm just going to move us forward. So just a few housekeeping reminders before we get stuck in. Just a reminder to keep your microphone muted during the session. And please do say hello and introduce yourselves in the chat box. And also, if you have questions for Jonathan or Jamie, or if you'd like to share your experiences and thoughts and comments, please do that in the chat box as well. And also, if you have any technical issues, if you're struggling with connections, for example. We are recording today's session and we will make that available on the website to share afterwards. And we would invite you to tweet and to share your thoughts about today's session on social media. We have the hashtag Insight 2021, and we'd love it if you tag us as well with Midlands DSN or Strategy_Unit. Oh, I've gone too far forward. Let me just stop sharing a second. There we go. So I just thought I'd start with a couple of sort of comments about the thinking behind this session. So in my role, I lead on evidence and knowledge mobilisation within the Midlands Decision Support Network. And I spend a lot of time thinking and talking with colleagues about how we can help decision makers in health and care apply the insights from analysis, evaluation, evidence review, and so on to improve outcomes. And we know that insights will take us so far, they provide the potential for improvement, but we know that we need to take action to be able to realise those improvements. And so much of what we know from research or analysis or practice can get lost, which means missed opportunities to improve patient care, wasted resources, and potentially even harm as well. So throughout Insight, we're looking at how we translate these insights into action effectively. And today's session, hearing from Jonathan and Jamie, I think is going to be particularly interesting in learning about what's happening across other different sectors as well. So in terms of how the session will run, I'm going to invite Jonathan and Jamie to present and share their presentations. And then we'll open up to some questions and discussion. So please do share your questions and comments in the chat box. And Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Alison. And what I'm going to do over the next 15, 20 minutes is give you some really practical frameworks and approaches to applying insights into action. And as Alison said, it's based on the social science. One is particularly from behavioral science. And the focus really is on what's useful to you. And I've spent over 20 years as a knowledge mobilizer. I guess that's the right term. I'm sure there's a better sort of language, but I've lived this both in terms of the practicalities of synthesizing research to try and inform decision making, and I'm doing that right now in the government in a team that synthesizes evidence for policy making across all of government, called the Open Innovation Team. And I've also looked at this very strategically in terms of setting up organizations such as evidence intermediaries like What Works centers. And these three frameworks I'm about to present to you are from those 20 years of experience. But I bet you have others. These are my preferred ones. And I'm very happy for you to shoot them down or say there are things missing. But they are, at the very least, based on the best available research, particularly social science and some of the behavioral sciences as well. So if I start going to my screen, one of the things I'd really like you to do as well when you're seeing these models is right at the end, I'm going to ask you to vote on which one you prefer. And I'm afraid I'm going to put you on the spot as well, where you can't just go, you prefer a bit one more than the other. It's to pick one, I'm afraid. So as you're hearing about these three frameworks, let me know which ones you would find helpful in your day job applying this in practice. But what are the three frameworks? So the first one is it's quite academic, but it's been referenced a lot back in 2010, so it's over a decade old, Best and Holmes. And I'm going to talk you through these three elements of it: the linear, relational, systems. Don't worry about the sort of language, but this is one I'm going to start on. The second one was alluded to by Alison, and this was a big project funded by the Wellcome Trust called The Science of Using Science, where we gathered all the available research we could find that's published, predominantly academic, but also some grey literature on what works in getting research used. So I'm going to talk through that one secondly. And then finally, there's the Behavioural Insights team, the so-called nudge unit. I was at Nesta for 10 years, which partly owned the Behavioural Insights team. In fact, I think they're coming to join them back again. And they came up with this EAST model: easy, timely, social, attractive. And I think this is a really helpful way of thinking about using insights into action in health and in other sectors as well. So those are my three, but let's start with the first one, Best and Holmes. Now, bear with me as I talk you through this from left to right, from linear to systems. Best and Holmes we're looking at this question of what are the structures and the underlying mechanisms when we're thinking about using research in decision making. And linear is probably the one we're most familiar with. That's the model of getting the website, getting the guidance, getting the communication out the door. It's something I certainly spent a lot of time doing over the last 20 years, honing that press release or making some training advice, getting it out the door, packaging in a way that's palatable and used. However, linear is not enough, and relational is perhaps where most people feel they have impact. By relational, we mean having that relationship. It might be bilateral with you and a patient or a client or a policymaker, but having that relationship of trust and sharing is what we hear anecdotally what works a lot. And I certainly have spent an enormous amount of time. I used to do the party conferences every year, trying to build relational paths to impact for research. It's a very time consuming, but another core part of it. The third and final area of the Best and Homes framework is systemic systems. This is the holy grail, where we want not just small bits and bobs of things, relational or linear, but we're really looking at the wider ecosystem, the structures around it. Is there a leadership culture in the area you work that really helps get research into decision making? Can we think about the wider political landscape? Are we living in a post-truth political world, for instance? What are the rewards, incentives? What are the infrastructures that can really help this get into our insights into action? So linear relational systems, when I first came across this mechanism, this framework, I found it a bit sort of academic, a bit like descriptive. Where does that really get me? But increasingly, I found it very helpful in thinking about my work and how I plan things out. Because I don't think this is an either or framework. You need the linear, you need to do good communications. I did a piece of work looking at people like NICE and other evidence intermediary bodies, and they all regretted how little resource they put into that bread and butter of really good linear communication, not just putting all your resource into the research element of the synthesis. Likewise, relational, crucial, likewise systems. So I think we need all three rather than either or. So the second of my three frameworks, and just a reminder for those people who have just arrived, there'll be a poll at the end, so you can choose which one you prefer the least. And I'd actually love to hear in the chat which one you think really is inappropriate for your day job. But the second one is the EAST model, and that comes from the Behavioral Insights team. Just to outline those four areas, the four diamonds in the EAST model, these came from a review of all the behavioral science and research and insights, and a framework to help decision makers wherever they might be. There might be a public health professional, a police officer, a policymaker. And it's some sort of universal messages that I think we can apply in our work thinking about insights into action. So easy is just that. Can we package up our research and insights in a way that's cognitively easy? That's challenging because research is rarely straightforward. We're looking at trying to tap into the seam of fast thinking here because we're cognitively lazy, we get cognitive overload, we're desperate to make decisions with the least amount of effort. We are human beings in a political real world. So how can we make our information, evidence, insights easy to use? The second one of the EAST model is A for attractive. This could be about packaging something up in a way that's palatable and enjoyable. Classic example might be something around visualization of data. We've all seen the boom that continues over the extraordinary way we can visualize evidence rather than putting it into some very dry academic text. So making it attractive. Then S from the EAST model is socializing it. Can you bring the people into the data and the abstractions? I've dealt with loads of politicians who will always retort to your academic research about what they've learned from their constituents who are in their office just the other day, with a real person struggling with a real problem out in the world. We need to meet that by bringing our own socialized evidence, bringing the humanity back into our evidence. And I feel we saw that very much around things like Brexit, where abstractions of economic models really didn't land. So social is the penultimate part of the East model. And then finally, timely. It's a bit of a no-brainer, but I'm afraid it's something we certainly in the research field fail on, is you've got to get your timing right. It can't be too early, it can't be too late. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment for the Open Innovation team in government, where we've got a very specific window of policy opportunity. And if I'm too late, it's just pointless. Sometimes you have to do things within a matter of weeks, even in hours. Trying to find that right timing is indeed an art, not just a science, but is vital. You might get lucky, you might have serendipity, and there's plenty of examples of research or other insights that were out of fashion, and they just got the stars aligned perfectly and they're able to get the right timing. But do go in thinking, what's the timeliness here? How can we get things to land at the right time? And with this East model, it's also worth being really cognizant of the cognitive biases we operate in. I'm sure these are very familiar to you, some of the cognitive biases. What I'm trying to say here is we need to work with the grain of our biases, whether it's as groups, as individuals, as a culture in the UK or whatever geography you're in. How can we work with those biases to help our insights actually get into action and make a difference? So this slide shows you some examples of these. On the left, framing is a classic one. Anyone in public health will be very aware of these, but you can use these framings in other contexts as well. So how do you package up your message in a way that would land? That doesn't mean distorting your facts and data and evidence, but it might mean packaging in a way that you know that your audience might respond to best of all. So work with those biases, be aware of them. They're not going to go away. We are not purely logical Dr. Spocks. We are deeply irrational, but predictably irrational. So the third and final framework, I'm going to spend a bit more time on, because I think there's some really useful insights into this framework. The COM-B comes from Susan Mickey from UCL. I'm sure you're very familiar with her. She's certainly in the media a lot through her work in SAGE during COVID. But actually, certainly in our field, her perhaps biggest claim to fame from her behavioral insights works was the COM-B framework. That was on capability, opportunity, and motivation for behavior change. That's the COMB. Now, I'll talk you through that. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it already. But what I want to show you is how helpful that is to thinking about research interaction. It's been used in so many other contexts, such as behavioral change, campaigns for public health. But actually, you could apply it for all sorts of research to make a difference. Now, what we did to apply that COM-B framework, to rewind, I actually helped commission the Epicenter at University College London to do a range of systematic and scoping reviews on all the available research that was published at that time. This was back in 2016, so it's a while ago. It's actually just been updated by a South African evidence synthesis center. But what can we learn from all the available social science? And that might cover everything from policing, management, implementation science. We really cast the net very widely to look at what works in terms of using evidence for decision making. And in blue, you'll see the final report. It's a very long, couple of hundred pages. There is a very good synopsis of that. And I'm going to talk you through some of the key lessons with some practical examples. But it's been very helpful for a range of institutions that have looked at applying research in their decision-making or promoting it in other people's decision-making. So on the right is one of the 12 work centres from the UK government, the Early Intervention Foundation. They've actually used this COMBI framework for their work around early intervention, particularly around children and early years. So it has a real practical use. This is not just an academic systematic review. It has day-to-day real value. So what's in this framework? Now, I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but this is capturing everything. And I'm going to talk you through all of the the 6 levels in the orange area, from awareness to structures, and look at the different mechanisms that make up this framework. So bear with me, and I'm going to give you really practical examples here of the sort of mechanisms that lead up to behavior change that involves capability, motivation, and opportunity. And again, I'll give you examples of capability, motivation, opportunity to bring this alive. But ultimately, our final goal is right at the bottom here on behavior change, specifically here about getting evidence used. So let's go through these 6 first of the orange mechanisms, the 6 mechanisms of the COMBI framework. The first one is on awareness raising. You might need in your environment, whatever it might be, the organization, the culture, the geography, the team, the committee, you might need to do some awareness raising, even on the value of evidence. Now, there's something like health, perhaps it's a no-brainer. It's certainly not a no-brainer in other areas of professional life. And this slide has a picture of, apologies, lots of white men and not enough women, from a signing of an evidence declaration that I organized 3 or 4 years ago, involving the chief execs, presidents and chairs of around 20 professional bodies, mostly in health. We also had the College of Policing there, Jamie, the Chartered College of Teaching, a new body for teachers, and others. And it was part of our awareness raising about the value for professionals of evidence to make better decisions. So we need to make the case. We can't just have it as a given, particularly in this day and age when we're fighting all sorts of anti-facts and anti-truth initiatives. The second of our 6 in the COMBI frameworks is we called agree, A for agree. Now this is about the users of our research going out to them and understanding what they want from research, building mutual understanding. So the Alzheimer's Society, for instance, spent a lot of time going to families, people with dementia, really understanding what would they find helpful from research. Let them define the research questions. And the evidence seems to be that this can help with the eventual take-up of the research when the research questions are helped defined by users, rather than say what academics think or other audiences, maybe they're funders and government bodies. So work with the users to define the research. The third of the 6 is about good old communication. And I talked at the start about the linear model for Best and Holmes, but clearly that's where a lot of resource, effort and time goes into getting our research communicated effectively. And I think the evidence that we reviewed for this body of work, the Science of Using Science, really showed the value of tailoring and targeting. Yeah, it doesn't need to be a massively whizzy expensive website or marketing campaign. If you can tailor it and target it, there is good evidence that really helps to make a difference. Now, in the slide, I've also got an old infographic understanding the wider evidence ecosystem of other organizations. These other organizations, one of the things you really see is how far we've come, and perhaps the elder members of this audience will join me in thinking how far we've come from making research more accessible than it was 10, 20 years ago, when it was all hidden behind paywalls and academic journals. The effort that's gone on to synthesizing research in a way that's actionable is really quite extraordinary. And I think we should recognize that, and there's certainly evidence that that helps for our research to land. And one example of this that I've been very impressed by is some of the What Works centres in the UK have created toolkits aimed at specific audiences. So this is the Education Endowment Foundation that has a toolkit very specifically aimed at teachers or school leaders. I've used it as well for my kids' school. It synthesizes all the available research through meta-analysis relevant to what works for children's outcomes in schools. And you can dig into the detail. You can see on this slide, there's information on the cost effectiveness of different interventions in the classroom, the strength of evidence. Those are, by the way, padlocks in the middle there, rather than handbags, as somebody pointed out. That's about the strength of evidence, the rigor and quality of evidence. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the months gained or even lost applying these interventions in the classroom. So we've got packaged up evidence that school teachers, heads can use in their day-to-day work. So communication and access has been vital, and really good evidence that works. Let's not forget that core bread and butter communication. But the fourth area that we looked at in our systematic review and scoping study was more tentative, and that's what we called interaction. Some might call this co-production of research. I've been a big fan of co-producing research so that you are working side by side, integrating with clinicians, other users, policymakers. An enormous amount of literature and effort has gone into interaction and co-production. But the reason why there's a question mark against co-production is we couldn't find enough evidence that this seemed to have an effect on the take-up of research. So our assumption was that co-production is a good thing because we're working with users, so those users use the research at the end. A fair enough assumption. Unfortunately, we just couldn't find enough research. That's not to say we found negative results. We just couldn't find enough research. And partly, I think that's because co-production is so poorly defined in the literature. So a question mark about interaction, although I remain a big fan of co-production and research. A fifth of our 6 mechanisms was on skills. And I have done an enormous amount over certainly the last 7 or 8 years in developing training programs to not only build the skills of policymakers or professionals and local authorities in finding and applying evidence and research, but also, I think just as importantly, building their confidence. So you as a policymaker, as an administrator, as somebody with a big commissioning budget, you can do some of this work. You know, you don't always have to go to super specialists, analysts, academics, synthesizers to do this work. And even if you do, can we build your confidence so you know what's good enough research? When is that campaigning think tank bullshitting you, as some MP put to me once? Can you tell when it's good enough for you to action in your day job? So building the skills and knowledge, confidence is crucial, and the evidence is quite clear that this can be very helpful in terms of research uptake. Now, the Venn diagram I've got here is actually for the UK government policymakers, but I've got examples of this in health, in professional groups. What we're looking here is not some amazing evidence skill base. It's having all three parts of this Venn diagram being in the interstices of this, where you're good politically, you can manage your bosses, your stakeholders, the public, and you're great on delivery. It's about evidence being a part of the mix, not dominant, part of the evidence-informed decision-making. So skills are crucial. Finally, and I will open this up to questions, or we'll go straight over to Jamie in a moment. The final element of this COMBI framework is about structure and process. This might seem reminiscent of the Best and Holmes framework I gave right at the start. It's the holy grail. What are the ways we can embed evidence in the systems we all work with? How do you hardwire it? How do you make sure that it's not always about entrepreneurial individuals or teams who can fly the flag for research? How can we embed it in those structures? And I've had multiple goes at doing this. The example I've got here, sorry, my slide is hazy here because it's from a report that we did with the campaigning body, the Centre About Science and the Institute of Government, when I was director of the Alliance for Useful Evidence at Nesta. We tried to think about how can government departments embed evidence by just nudging them to be more transparent about the evidence behind policymakers. If you go and look at a white paper, a piece of legislation, the latest announcement from Boris, can you find any evidence behind it? The reason for us trying to look at transparency, we created a framework. Indeed, the Centre About Science did a whole piece of work scoring different government departments, extraordinary piece of work. And they got into quite a lot of detail about things like 24-hour and 7 days a week opening of GP surgeries. Where's the evidence for that? Can we find the transparent data research analysis behind such policies? The reason why we wanted to do that was to create a structure to encourage evidence use. The thinking being, if you're more transparent about your evidence, maybe that would nudge people in government, in policy, to have better quality evidence because you're going to have to make it public. Now in South Africa, they've done something similar in that all their white papers have to have a section where they have to show their evidence. Now you can have nothing in there or very poor quality work, but that embedding into the decision-making process at least allows an opportunity to inform policy with some kind of evidence. So structure and process, you might have other ideas how we do that. It's the hard one, it's the really hard one, but it's a necessary part of making a difference. Now, those are the 6 mechanisms in our orange band here that go up to the COMBI framework. But just before I finish, I want to explain what that COMBI framework, the overarching thinking of it, which is this red theme. The framework that comes from Susan Mickey in UCL looks at the value of not looking at one isolated part of behavior change alone, but looking at a package. Capability. So in our area, it might be the capability to understand, have the skills to understand evidence and apply it to practice. But you can't have that without some degree of motivation, might be intrinsic. I'm working with lots of professional groups who really feel the passion to do research, do it themselves, apply it, not because they're told to do it, not because there's some regulatory infrastructure, but they feel the intrinsic motivation to use it in their daily work. So the motivation needs to be there. And finally, the opportunity. So if there are no opportunities, I did some work on children's social care in the run-up to setting up a What Works Centre in children's social care for the Department for Education. And we carried out some very light touch field work, basically ethnographic, certainly participant observation work on social workers, trying to understand the opportunities for a social worker to even access any sort of evidence, let alone apply it. And, you know, following them in onto the doorstep of people's homes and watching their travel and their day-to-day work, there weren't any real opportunities unless they were doing it at home in their free time to look at research, learn from it, apply it. So having those opportunities, but equally with capability and motivation, is vital. And that would be one key message from this framework. A lot of the research that we looked at didn't look at things in isolation, whether it's skills or awareness raising. A cocktail of measures is probably going to be the most effective and successful strategy for getting research used. But finally, I do want to remind you to do a poll, and Alison, if you could share that poll in a moment, that would be great, because I'd love to know what you think of those three frameworks, which ones you think you might already be using or could use. I chose them very specifically because I've applied them in my work over the last few years. There are lots more. I looked at a paper last week in implementation science, and there were 17 frameworks, models, and structures, and they were just looking at where local context had been taken into account. I found one PhD student who's doing something on implementation of health, who's found an even longer list of such frameworks. I'm sure there are others that are great. Please do share them. But what I'm interested in is, what can we use here to help your action? What can actually be used, rather than making academics or people working in mobilization, implementation, happy and feel they've included everything. The irony of some of the frameworks out there is, even though they're about implementation of evidence or use, they're not actually very implementable. And I like to think those three are the most helpful. So great that you're doing a poll now. Which one would you find the most helpful? And maybe in the Q&A, you also have some scathing comments on some of them that I would love to hear too. So thank you for that. Please do bring them on. I'm going to just I'll give you one more minute to do your responses on the poll. They're going up and down. As you do it, I want to talk about one other key message, which is perhaps a take-home message, which is about dissemination is dead. I think our default is dissemination. And I talked to you about it as like the linear model of best and homes, or maybe it was the awareness raising of the COMBI framework, or maybe it was the E of East in the so-called nudge team of the behavioral insights team. Dissemination is dead, said the former head of the World Bank Evaluation Program. You know, we need to be much more sophisticated. I think that message can sometimes be overplayed. You do need some dissemination. You can't be completely invisible. You do need good marketing, savvy marketing, tailored and targeted. But we do need to think about the whole ecosystem, different ways of approaching this. There's never going to be one single magic bullet, one training program, one marketing initiative. It's going to be a package of those things. But I'm going to finish there and just summarize there that, you've gone for the COMBI framework. Great. I'm delighted you have. But I see there's 33%, about a third have gone for East. And Best in the Homes has done the worst at 20%. Really interesting. Thank you for that. So the best was the least, and the COMBI at the end was the best, if I can mix up my language. But really interesting to know what you think of those, and I really look forward to hearing your suggestions for other approaches or questions next. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we'll go straight into Jamie's presentation next, and then perhaps we can bring the questions and comments together at the end. So, Jamie, are you all lined up to start presenting?
Hi there, Alison. I think I'm lined up. Let's just see if we can do it on the tiny screen I've got here in front of me. Hopefully it's just as we set it up, and you will be able to see very shortly the screen that we had up. Okay, not worked that well. Let's try again. How's this? Can people hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, and I think it's just on my screen, it's just taking a little while to come up, but I think it is working. I can see the slide now, but it's got a little bit of a header on it, I think. So the bottom of the slide is just...
Yeah, I think I can make this bigger.
Ah, perfect.
The wonders of modern science. I had it set up all very nice on my laptop.
There we go.
But then realised my laptop wouldn't get to work and wouldn't let Zoom go on it. So we've had to revert to a small phone in the background. Okay, can we see the slides okay now?
Yep, they look great. Yep, thank you.
Okay. I can't see while I'm presenting the comments coming up, and I don't think I can reach my microphone off button either. So forgive me. If you need to interrupt me, then just shout up. So, okay. I'm Jamie Hobday. I'm a police officer with 28 years service from the West Midlands police area. I'm going to talk to you now about a particular project we ran a few years back. It was all about diverting suspects or offenders from court for the more minor offences, and had some really interesting two key decision points in it. And as the decision support network is supporting this, I thought this would be a particularly interesting element to pick up on. I think actually it fits really nicely after Jonathan's work, because he's given us some broad concepts and theories to talk about and to frame this in. So hopefully yourselves, as well as me, as we go through this, we'll now be looking at this with a slightly different view than we might have done 45 minutes ago. And I think it gives us a real good vehicle for using those frameworks and maybe considering some of the lessons we could learn. So it's about diversion from court. It's about a project called Turning Point, which trialled in effect a new style of diversion from court with a new cohort of individuals, of offenders. And within this, there are two key decision points. Not knowing how long I would be talking for or how long I've got exactly, I've got quite a bit of detail about the first one, and we'll talk about that and then some of the results we've got. And if we've got time, I'll talk about the second one and then go on to some final thoughts afterwards. So that's the broad play if we're going through. A little bit of information about myself. I mentioned a police officer, West Midlands Police. At the time of doing this about 5 years ago, this project, I was based within a headquarters department looking at criminal justice policy. You'll see as we go through that. This is why we're working on this. I'm now based in Walsall. I'm in a partnerships role, so working with many good partners in the local authority, the NHS, and others as well, looking to reduce crime and reduce harm in the community in Walsall in particular. Okay, so first of all, about Turning Point. Turning Point was a project looking at taking a slightly different cohort of offenders, a group of offenders who wouldn't normally divert from court, and seeing if those had committed a low-risk offence and were low-risk offenders, whether we could both get lower reoffending rates, save money, and hopefully get better victim satisfaction by doing something other than taking these individuals to court. It had two key decision points. One was around who we selected to bring into the project, and then secondly was around what we then did with those individuals. So I guess in a health context, what the sort of treatment would be for those individuals that we would agree with them. So I've got quite a lot of information on the slide. I'm not going to go and repeat all of the slides for you because you can read that yourself, and copies are available afterwards if you want to go through some more of that detail. But in effect, we started out with a lot of work with custody officers as the first decision makers to talk to them about what we're doing, because in taking offenders out of the court process that you would normally put in, as you might imagine, there was quite a bit of hesitation and concern around doing that. So we did have initially quite a bit of work with ourselves, with all the police officers involved, but mostly the custody officers, as they had this key decision, to sort of explain to them why this was a good idea and what we were looking to do and why they ought to give it a go. Now, to be clear about this project was run as a randomised controlled trial. So it was a test, and it wasn't necessarily doomed to succeed, as many police pilots are, but we were going to work with Cambridge University, the Institute of Criminology, to see what the impact was on those three main measures that I mentioned earlier: impact on reducing reoffending, on the cost of this, and on the victim satisfaction. And all the way through this project, we were comparing that to an identical cohort that was still put through to court as normal, and we measured those outcomes on both cases so we could compare them with each other. So the slide here talks about why we're doing this. So as custody officers understood, the vast majority of cases, 2/3 of cases that go through to a magistrate's court end up in a fine anyway. The custody officers are some of the officers that see the most of the churn of the same recidivist offenders coming through again and again, often for minor offences, but ending up in court because they've committed so many offences before. And we also shared with them a good amount of the evidence that's out there now that shows that, certainly for juveniles, that putting them through the court process, sort of formally processing them, is more likely.
I think we've lost your sound, Jamie.
I've lost sound as well, Alison. It's not you.
Okay, have I changed the slide onto a slide entitled Randomised Control Trial?
Yes.
Jolly good. Okay, so just to show what I've just said, two key decision points. One was around whether to include someone in this trial, so to divert from court or not. And then the second decision point was around what interventions, treatments we would do with that particular offender. There was some close tracking that went through, and it's important to mention now as well that we attempted to run this project with pretty much the staffing as is. Again, on the grounds we didn't want this to be seen or even to be a project that was doomed to succeed. We weren't going to overstaff it, as it were, to make sure it succeeded, because we wanted that if it were successful, we wanted other forces to be reassured that actually it's something they could implement from the staffing they've got there, rather than having to put over and above the normal amount of staffing that such a case like that might have. So the first key decision was how we separate the high risk and the low risk offenders, so that we can put the low risk ones into a low cost, high impact intervention. This decision was initially made by custody officers in one custody suite. Eventually, the project lasted for 3 years. After a year, or over the first year, we slowly extended the number of custody officers from the first cohort at one police station, one custody block of around 20 police officers in the custody officer role, to around about 100 custody officers across 5 custody suites, covering the whole of Birmingham. So there was quite a number of people we had to train and support in their decision making. And this was about the custody officers being the right time and the right place to make this decision. It also gave us the added advantage that obviously was a much smaller group to train up and give the decision make to, rather than all officers that were dealing with offenders. And it also gave us a really big advantage, was that these custody staff are all sat inside custody suites with computers in front of them that they're working from and recording, making a contemporaneous record of what happens to the suspect when they're in custody. So we were able, because of that, to develop a decision support tool on the computer over time that really helped improve the quality of decision making in this situation. Here we go. So the second key decision was around ensuring how we get the best interventions for each individual offender. So obviously we had offenders coming through to us for different types of offending, but also with different types of need. Some homeless, some victims of other crimes, some in difficult homes or in domestic abuse situations, some without an income, some with all sorts of psychological or mental problems as well. So the sort of cases we were working on needed a bespoke intervention or treatment for each individual. Numbers wise, as I said earlier, we had over 100 officers in the custody block by the end of this case. We were looking at all the cases that came into custody, and eventually those were dealt with out of custody as well for decision making. But because we were looking at quite a specific and small group of offenders, those numbers coming through were quite small. So although we were processing over the 3 years, over sort of 15,000 cases, so 15,000 decisions, there was only 700 of those, which is around about 2%, I think off the top of my head, that were eligible for this. So it became part of day-to-day business, and we had to build this in and make it easy and simple for the custody officers to do this decision making and identify the suitable cases as they went through their daily business. Because it was also a project we were working with an external provider on, in this case, Cambridge University, who needed some of this data, we also had to make sure that our decision-making tool captured information, but only captured non-personal data, so as that could be shared with Cambridge University. The decision to include basically took a small sliver of individuals that weren't suitable for a current out-of-court disposal, would normally have gone to court, but actually it was a low-risk case, and we wanted to try this approach where we would divert them from court, but with always the ability to escalate that back to court if need be. So sort of sword of Damocles was seen as an effective way from previous evidence of a way to get compliance and to help reduce reoffending in the long term. Here, I won't go through in detail, but there's some of the key elements that were included. One of them being that an admission wasn't required, and that was out of step with the regime at the time, and I think it still is now. I'm not working in this area, but I still think that most diversions from court that we could take to court require an admission. We were keen that we didn't want that to be a blocker to try and reduce reoffending, as the evidence didn't suggest that whether an admission was given or not to the police, that was a significant factor in either reoffending or not reoffending. So that decision, the inclusion decision, was facilitated with an online decision support tool. This decision support tool also has been written about within experimental criminology, as it also performed the randomisation role of deciding whether, when we got a suitable case, whether that individual would be randomised to a group that got offered the diversion, or whether that group carried on and were prosecuted as normal at the time. And that's quite unusual, because in the past, I believe, most randomisation decisions like this have been done by a researcher who has to physically be on the scene and be available. So actually having a tool that officers could do this themselves was massively advantageous, in that it meant that we didn't need researchers around all the time, and that we could make these decisions 24/7. There were just 12 questions included in this to see if cases were eligible or not, and very importantly, we decided that the custody officers would have a really important role in identifying cases that, although they might fit that criteria, for some other reason that we hadn't anticipated, were not suitable. So we did give the police officers, the custody officers, the position or the power to veto a record and not put it forward to randomisation, and therefore wouldn't allow it to potentially be diverted. And what was important about this was the fact that we built in a system where we would ask officers to justify that decision. And it was actually that evidence that they recorded, which was then picked up and reviewed by myself, that allowed us to improve that decision making no end. And it was through that evidence that was collected that we found at an early stage there was some inappropriate exclusions and some inappropriate inclusions. And that led us to understand the fact that we needed to do more to improve the decision making in this particular situation. So I've got some screenshots now that hopefully I'll be able to whip through reasonably quickly. They're just to give you a flavour of what this decision support tool looked like. It was bespoke, made for us, so it's fairly basic. It's not very flashy. It won't compare, I'm afraid, with YouTube or the like, but it did do the job. So this was the initial version we rolled out. We were testing just in one custody block to begin with. In total, were 12 questions. There's one just off the bottom there, and it covered predominantly. There were some really key questions we had to ask at the beginning, but the questions on after question 3 onwards were really about making sure that the criteria that we'd agreed with the CPS, that all those particular specific exclusions they wanted were included in this. So they weren't often, we were very, very rarely ticked yes to any of the questions 3 to 12, because they were quite rare cases, but ones that the CPS had insisted that we didn't include. The whole process was developed, and this is the model for the way that decision making is made around prosecutions in the UK. The whole process was agreed with the CPS, but the decisions were entirely made by the police, because that initial decision is a police decision. And the CPS were comfortable with that, as long as they had some input into the guidance that officers had around making those decisions. So that was quite a basic questionnaire, and that came back with some interesting information. So here are some answers to the veto question. So these are cases where, going through the question set, the machine would indicate to the custody officer that this case was suitable for being put into turning point, potentially, and to go forward. That case would then be randomised into a group that would be offered turning point, and it would be the offender's choice whether to accept that or not, because these are all cases that then would go to court in a normal situation, or alternatively those would go to court as normal. And as you can see here, if you would know more about the rationale as to why we were looking at this, we were very much looking at trying to tackle the issues behind offending. What was it that was driving the suspect's offending? So the responses we've got here as to why custody officers have removed a case from turning point, the ones that we've highlighted in bold, are ones that really quite clearly go against the whole ethos of what we're trying to do. So, for example, where we've got someone who's a severe alcoholic, we know that taking that individual to the court and fining them is very rarely going to do anything about their alcoholism, and therefore is not going to impact on their drinking at all. So that would be a case that we would be saying these are exactly the sort of cases we want to remove the churn going through magistrate court, because we're pretty confident we can get a better outcome at a lower cost, and also victims will be happier too. Likewise, around restorative justice being mentioned there, or long-standing neighbour disputes. Again, prosecuting one side of a neighbour dispute very, very rarely throws any cold water onto the fire that's going on there. So what this is showing to us then is that we still need to do a bit of work on the decision making of custody officers. We also found during this first period other problems with the process we've devised. So the CPS were happy with us where a case had already had CPS advice on it, that actually we could still divert a case, but officers weren't aware or weren't taking that on board. When cases were being signed from custody and they were being offered turning point and taking it up, those cases were handed over to offender managers to deal with the case, but we had situations where those offender managers were then coming back with this case and saying, no, it's not suitable for us, we really can't have it, and other sorts of things that we've got listed here. So it was a bit of a clunky process, and clearly it wasn't working as well as it could do. And there was some lack of trust, I should say, in the actual online tool, because certainly in policing at the moment, I'm not sure what it's like in health or elsewhere, using a sort of a guidance tool, a handrail, as we described this, for helping decisions to get made, was something that is not very, it's not common in policing. So this was quite an unusual situation. I have to say it wasn't that popular with officers, especially custody officers, who will have a lot of authority to make decisions as they see best fit according to guidance and the law, and actually having to comply with a tool that in a way I guess they could accept or judge this as criticising their expertise, or maybe taking that autonomy away from them. So when we found these issues and discovered it, we took a certain number of actions, and this is really, I guess, a number of what this talk is about. It's about how do we improve, how do we use evidence to improve. So the whole of Turning Point was based on a very strong evidence base. It says for low risk offenders, and certainly those with other issues going on in their lives that underpin their offending, diversion from court is likely to be very effective, or more effective than court, at reducing reoffending, and likely to be significantly more cost effective. So the way we helped try and improve the decision making here was through a number of steps, and these really are ordered in order of importance that we feel made the most impact on the improvements that we found. So first of all, we put more effort into this decision-making support tool that was online. And we described this as a bounded decision-making because it still gave officers freedom, and we kept in, importantly, that ability for officers to veto a decision if they felt it was really inappropriate for some reason that we were unlikely to be able to preempt or predict. But it did close down some of the more obvious inappropriate options that they were taking otherwise. So the tool themselves, when they used it, helped guide them towards the right decision, but didn't force them into that area, importantly. Within that, we use things called red flags, which we would say, and I've got a picture coming up later on, there would be sometimes a question. If they answered a question one way, and it's going to, potentially knock a case out or keep a case in, and that might not be obvious, or it was a repeat error position, then actually we'd have a flag come up just to check with the officer, saying, this is what's about to happen. Are you sure that's what you meant to do? Likewise, we've had feedback, as I mentioned earlier, with the questions you've already seen on the screen. A lot of those were very rare questions, but that were only relevant in a small percentage of cases. So we designed the system to be easier. Again, coming back to what Jonathan's described earlier, we tried to make the whole process easier for officers to use. And actually now we went through the main key questions first, and then actually in those situations where none of the other questions were relevant, because, for example, the case was already ineligible, we didn't ask those extra questions at all. So it made it much easier for officers to use, and they were obviously thankful that we were removing some sort of administration off them that wasn't really supporting or helping them and just taking up time. We automated some administration tasks, and we also then, so this is basically through the tool. We then went on outside of the tool to do things like ensure that the information that's being collected by the tool came through to my team who were monitoring this amongst their day-to-day work, were monitoring these decisions immediately. So when a decision was made and the officer pressed on the program, decision made, we would get an email with that. Rather than having to go and look at a database when we had time, we'd get an email that immediately said, here's the decision that's just been made. So that allowed us to give feedback, be it positive or be it corrective, to the officers in live time. We also added some training, excuse me. So because of some of the lack of awareness around the rationale of what we were trying to do, the decision support tool couldn't really explain why it was doing what it was doing. We'd just take you through the steps. So we spent some time. We were lucky to have a researcher with us to help develop this tool, and that researcher spent time going around and speaking to custody officers, either one-to-one or 1 to 2 or 3 in small groups. And we felt that that sort of personal treatment was important and was good because it also allowed the researcher to go over the most common mistakes that were being made as well. And then finally, we also produced a newsletter to try and advertise and disseminate some of the good news mainly, or to highlight some of the common problems that came out of this. So those are our 3 main tactics for improving the decision making. And again, I'd ask you just to think back to the previous presentation, how they might fit into any of those free frameworks that have just been explained. Here's some quick.
Sorry, can I just give you a 4-minute warning?
Okay, already. My apologies. In that case, these are slideshows of the revamped tool. So there's one of your red flags. There's some of the additional questions that you only came to if you needed to. There's the veto question and the free text for the officer to put in their decision and rationalise their decision that we could then review. And then some of the admin it helped with, so you then automatically go to print some of the paperwork that was required instead of having to go to a separate folder and print off a document sort of manually. And you could also get to send an email to refer the case on further on. So again, it's smoothed, made the whole process much easier. So the impact of these improvements is interesting. So the research we did, and here we have on the y-axis with the number of inappropriate referrals made, or inappropriate decisions, I should say, inappropriate exclusions. And we've got the time along the bottom there, and the time months are highlighted in pink, and when we had a research present. And you can see phase 1 and phase 2 here, but before we made the main improvements and put the effort into the added development and training to officers, and you can see quite a significant step change down in the number of inappropriate decisions made. So our conclusion from that is those 6 steps we put in were fairly effective. Other research we've done as well, I just show this to show actually that we didn't get, we looked at whether we had a group of officers making bad decisions and a group making good decisions. The reality is here, as you see, there's a lot of overlap. So actually it was officers making good decisions sometimes and bad decisions sometimes, as well as groups that made one or the other. And this is the benefit, I guess, of having an academic to work alongside us. Overall, early initial outcomes from the project, they still need to be written up, were very significant in reducing harm around 30 to 40%, increasing the amount of justice that was imposed by 30 to 40%, and reducing costs by 40 to 50%. Now they are, if you know criminal justice and the sort of results we get out of interventions in criminal justice, these are quite outstanding. So I'm going to skip through these and talk about decision-making process, because historically these decisions have been made, the whole process has been set up either towards more or less discretion and more or less sort of restriction of how decisions are made. And because we're running out of time, I'm going to skip through the key decision 2 element and go straight on to the 2 was very similar as well. We did similar work and improved the outcomes. So the reality is that we did collect all the data we needed to compare the reoffending over time. We had to wait 2 years after the end of the project to see what the impact on reoffending would be. And there was significant discussion when we'd connected enough information about whether we'd continue with the project anyway, to keep that momentum behind the work we were doing. And then for, bearing in mind the initial results have been so positive, to not only get the benefits, but also to potentially keep the skills out in the force. That was decided not to at the time we were going through, we think about 2015, we were going through the real hit of austerity on the force. So the project was sort of curtailed at that stage. Cambridge still haven't published their results, but they're planning to now. This is quite some time after the experiment was run. They've done some further analysis in there around racial disparity that was never planned to begin with, which is a big positive. And a number of other projects have spun out in other forces that are doing very similar work. So the project has had an impact. I would say probably more on the national scene than it has on the West Midlands police scene, which you might find is a little bit odd considering we put all the effort into running this project to begin with. And then quickly looking through this, I've rooted out some interesting quotes from you around how difficult it is in policing to make both evidence-based practice or evidence-based policing stick. And also how hard it is, I guess, on a broader aspect to enable change within a large organisation. West Midlands Police has over 10,000 staff, and obviously has a day-to-day job in protecting the public. It can't take much time off from doing that for its staff in order to train and improve. Another quote there that's very interesting, and finally, a quote from our primary investigator from Cambridge University that talks about policing more generally and how actually we've got this tendency, and again this might be the same in the health or other professional areas, to either feast on a new initiative or priority and then famine, which is to return back to a focus on crime control and the way we've always done things. And I'm finally just coming to the last slide here, apologies if I've overrun, which is really around what we learn from this and how we learn as an organisation to take evidence, to develop evidence if we did in this situation, but then what are the barriers to that being taken further forward and adopted on a wider basis? As we've seen from Turning Point, we got some very positive interim or early results out of it, yet there still seem to be barriers that prevent us from taking that learning and adapting it and taking it on within West Midlands Police. And for me, there's a number of different areas of academia or of science that can explain that to us. Implementation science is something we've looked into quite a bit around how implementing anything can be more difficult than we expect to begin with. And I've listed there some other areas that produce useful evidence as to how we can take evidence and improve our practice based on it. So having overgone already, I will pause it there and see if I can bring the screen back to myself.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jamie. That's been so interesting to hear about your experiences in a different part of the public sector. So we've heard now from Jonathan and Jamie, and it's been really interesting to hear how those different frameworks can be used in different settings, and also just understanding some of the challenges across other bits of the public sector. And there's a lot that you both said that just sounded so familiar there. And so particularly around, you know, Jamie, you were talking about understanding the context in which decisions are being made, and also I think, Jonathan, you talked about decision-making behaviours and understanding more about that to be able to help people to apply evidence, and really understanding the role of evidence or insights in that decision-making process. So alongside other considerations like experience, but also financial considerations, because we're, you know, taxpayer-funded services. And interestingly, you were both talking about collecting data on impact, translating some of these insights into tools that are easier to use in these sort of high-pressure situations. And also it was interesting about, you know, the collecting and understanding the impact and just collecting some of that data. So there's a lot of themes there that feel really familiar. I'm going to ask Rachel if there are any questions or comments in the chat. I've got a couple lined up if Rachel needs a few moments to do that. And actually, if I give Rachel a couple of minutes, I think one of the things, and Jamie, you alluded to this with the austerity cuts, and I guess one of the challenges we face in the NHS is around capacity to do some of this work, and also the constant change, and you mentioned about the changes in policy and so on. And I just wondered if either of you have any reflections about, you know, how we do this kind of work when the capacity is quite limited. Are there more opportunities to do more collaboration, for example?
I'm happy to answer first and then pass over to Jonathan. I certainly think so. I think in reality, from what I've seen in my service, is that it's very difficult to do some of this research in addition to a day job, obviously fills your time. And that often is when budgets are tight, that's often the way that organisations try to do it. So when we can do away with the sort of strategy or investigation or evaluation unit, and we'll just make evaluation everyone's job. Well, sort of on paper that looks like a good idea, but in reality it's often the first thing that gets left behind in the rush. So I think it's difficult. In reality, it comes down, I think, to the strategic sort of leadership, doesn't it, really, about how important is it to improve, and do they see improvement as something that is single agency or partnership? That question differs, I think, between different police leaders, but for me, there's an obvious answer. But you do have to invest in it. It's about having that faith, isn't it, and measuring it carefully so as you are confident that the investment you're putting in is outweighed by the benefit you're getting out.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And the costs and benefits is a vital message. I mean, it can be a controversial message, but you know, this can evidence help save money in terms of times of austerity, certainly using resources efficiently. I think that's a good way of selling it, going back to some of that, the combi framework and the mechanisms, you know, the proselytizing for evidence. It is more effective with some audiences if you put the pound or dollar euro sign in about it. That this is, you know, could save money. Yes, commissioning new evaluations and the other elements can be expensive, but not necessarily, particularly in your question, as you mentioned about partnerships and collaborations. Although universities are under the cosh, they really have their own pressures. There is an enormous resource there. And, you know, certainly I benefit from lots of free PhD students doing some extraordinarily valuable work, coming to work with us in the Open Innovation team. Just brilliant talent. If you get the right people, it's quite very, very cost effective indeed. So, but I think making the message that this can help with saving money, and sometimes there's a lot of stuff, you know, we're living in a time of austerity and a sort of crisis. This stuff can help with decision making and crisis as well. It really can. When you really are under so many pressures, there are ways that we can learn from research to help with that.
Yeah, I guess the last couple of years have been particularly interesting, I guess, and I think there have been, I think at the first few weeks or months of the pandemic, I think people were so busy trying to respond, I think it was quite difficult, but I think over time we saw much more people sharing, and at least even if they weren't able to collaborate, at least sharing to avoid some duplication and so on. So that's been quite interesting. You also mentioned, Jonathan, about socializing the evidence, and I wondered, because it's something that we sort of grappling with, particularly in the pandemic, has shown this around to what extent we can engage patient groups, members of the public, local communities in sort of understanding and applying the evidence to understand how decisions are made, maybe. And I just wondered if you had any reflections, and also Jamie, you might have the same in terms of, you mentioned about victim satisfaction, about how we might be doing that more effectively.
Yes, I do have some suggestions about how we do that more effectively. I think there's two elements of that. One is improving the evidence itself, where we get it from. The other one is socializing in terms of how we communicate the research. So taking the first part to begin with, is it's, you know, the problem with so much evidence is it's abstract, it's not related to people's day-to-day lives, and I mentioned Brexit as a classic example of that. You know, the statistical evidence flowing around, or economic models that just didn't land, and that sort of famous heckle in a BBC debate where it was Britain only changing Europe, which is a sort of King's College London think tank. The head of that saying, you know, he's been very balanced, I must say, about the pros and cons of Brexit and the economic consequences. And the heckle was, you know, well, that's your GDP, not ours. And that really lands with lots of evidence that that's your evidence, it's not ours. And I think there's a lot we can do from public participation, particularly more sophisticated deliberative models. I've been involved in some of the patient groups and some other consultations, and I'm worried about some of the biases that creep in over those. There's a whole body of work on how we deal with deliberative forums like citizen juries, citizen assemblies, and we saw a really interesting citizen assembly for the select committee looking at health and social care, particularly how we fund care. Certainly other countries have done that really well, and I think we need to get much more sophisticated about how we go around that, rather than your bog standard public consultation or town hall assembly. And indeed, this, you know, it's really good, predominantly political science, but also wider stuff from social psychology about how we get that right and don't have our own type of groupthink. So that's the research element. And then just very briefly, the other elements on socializing the communication of it. Some of that is just, you know, giving that anonymous anecdote, a real person really reflecting, as long as it's reflecting the wider research and is not just a sort of outlier anecdote. I think we need to tap into that, particularly when you get confronted by a politician saying, well, my constituent says X. What have we got that's real lives, lived experience to retort to that?
Great, thank you. Jamie, did you want to make any comments?
Yeah, I didn't realise with that as well. I think in criminal justice is a little bit different. So one of the things we do find, and we're increasingly trying to engage the public as well as victims and offenders, those sort of more directly affected by crime, in the work we're doing, is that it's important, but we often get the feedback that that those individuals won't feel they have the understanding of the complexities of, say, the system to help about that. So they're more than willing to give their views and thoughts and how things affected them. But if we take that a stage further and say, well, you know, do you think this is a good way of working or not? Then we often get pushback and say, well, it's unfair to ask us. We just don't have that view that you have of that. So that's interesting. It's about what we ask them and how we incorporate that support as well. I guess for policing more broadly is we need to get better. We recognise we need to get better at just educating and engaging the public about our job and what we do and what we're trying to tackle, and to a degree about what works, because there's a lot of clamour, especially from politicians, about the way to respond to crime and disorder that frankly is either a waste of money or is actually going to backfire and make things worse. But we're not very good at sort of getting out and explaining that. And actually a lot of that sort of contact with victims and participants, if you say that more broadly, is a lot of it is just about being more open. And actually that the service would benefit from being much more open, I guess, and vulnerable sometimes to the public about what it's doing and why it's doing it, and engaging in conversations about that, rather than maybe just going in and thinking, well, we need to consult with you guys because we want something out of it. So I think there's a bigger picture and a different context for policing again there.
Thank you. I think we've got one more question in the chat. So Erin is asking, when time or resources are limited, how can we go about prioritising the different mechanisms to influence evidence use, for example, across the 6 mechanisms in the COMBI model? So yeah, who would like to go first?
Yeah, I'll have a go. It's a very good question. How do you prioritize those different mechanisms? I mean, personally, I think the best way to approach it is thinking it's a long game here. There is no magic bullet, single kind of toolkit that's going to fix it all. Although toolkits are really essential, and I'm really interested in sort of clinical decision aid tools, and Jamie outlined a particular model there. I think seeing a longer game, and it might be that you need to build in some supporters early on who are your champions and allies to advance this agenda and have some quick wins. So I've been working with various evidence institutions, and the key message you get there is how long it all takes, and you know, not just applying research, but actually generating it and synthesizing it. And I'm afraid, you know, your funders and other stakeholders and patients are getting a few quick wins. And I was really struck by the value of really cost-effective things like tailored and targeted sort of emails or WhatsApp groups or alerts that really, they weren't that whizzy, but saying, you know, this stuff really helps. And don't worry, it's quite old-fashioned kind of an email note or some defaulted, you know, thing that I come into when I log onto the website. Make it easy, fast, cheap. Having some of that as well as the longer game of the systems change, a structure, which is really hard. Got to aim for it, but will take time.
Great, thank you. Jamie, anything to add?
Oh yeah, I think that when we're looking at these situations, and we're both, I think, looking at sort of social policy, aren't we, broadly? All of us are, that it's a very complicated environment, it's a big system. And rarely when you look at systems interventions, rarely is there, you know, it's not so much about a particular straight that you're taking or a particular approach you're taking. It's about the whole package. So it's about doing everything to a degree and not just saying, well, actually, if we go big on item 1 and 2 out of 8, that's going to get it for us. We need to, each bit supports other bits, doesn't it? So it's about doing that. And then secondly, about context being everything at the end of the day, so that it will differ, I guess, on what you're trying to do and what your target group is. So you need to be very clear about what you're looking to achieve, and then which you think of those particular approaches, which of those levers you think will be the most effective in this area. And like Jonathan says, again, you know, if it's something you want to do with Twitter or with social media, that can be a fantastic way of getting to big numbers. But actually, if your group that you're trying to tackle aren't on social media, it's going to be pointless. So it's again about being bespoke and tailoring your interventions to the actual context and outcomes you're looking to get.
That's great, thank you very much. And I think we're probably just about coming to time now. So so thank you both so much for taking the time to share your reflections, your thoughts, your comments, and answering our questions. I hope everybody's going to join me in some virtual applause, and just to say thank you very much. We really do appreciate that. There's been a lot there this afternoon that I've heard that gives me some food for thought. So so thank you both for taking the time to join us today. So all that remains is to say thank you very much to our 2 speakers, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope you've enjoyed the session, and hope to see you at more Insight events over the course of the next week or so. Thank you so much.